Hello, everyone. Today we are with John Allen Gay to discuss the recent developments in the Middle East and especially the US-Iran relationship. I would like to first introduce John Allen Gay. He's a foreign policy analyst specializing in US Middle Eastern policy with a focus on US-Iran relations and regional security. He's the executive director of the John Quincy Adams Society, a nonpartisan organization promoting restraint in US foreign policy. He has written extensively on Iran's nuclear program, US strategy in the Middle East, and the potential consequences of military conflict in the region. He's also the co-author of War with Iran, Political, Military, and Economic Consequences, a book which examines the possible outcomes of a US-Iran confrontation. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We're very glad to have you, John.
And thank you for having me on, Zeka.
I would first like to start with the very recent developments on US strikes on Houthis. With the US launching strikes against the Houthis, what do you think is Washington's ultimate goal there? Is this purely about protecting Red Sea shipping and deterring attacks, or is there a broader strategy to pressure Iran indirectly by targeting its regional network? Do you see this as an act of escalation that could eventually lead to direct US-Iran tensions?
Yes, I think the administration's policy on the Houthis means different things to different people. I suspect, including within the administration. There are certainly voices there who would like to see a broader U.S.-Iran confrontation, and who I think are pushing for the kind of message we saw in a social media post from President Trump the other day, essentially saying the United States will treat Iran as responsible for actions by the Houthis. And we haven't yet seen what that's going to mean in practice, because it's safe to assume that the Houthis will continue their military efforts. And so we all have to wonder what will then follow. Because there is a certain, I think the administration would perceive a reputation risk in not following up in some way on that. And there was even some rumors, which turned out to be entirely false, going around that the United States had already targeted an Iranian ship. I would suspect that there are probably Iranian assets present in Yemen that, if the United States wanted to target Iranian assets, could hit within Yemen, which would be escalatory, though less escalatory than hitting Iran directly. That said, I think there are a couple of other logics at play in this confrontation. One is that the United States is a maritime power. We do a lot of international trade by the sea, and therefore we care about the freedom of international trade on the sea, particularly of American ships, American goods, and American companies. Those are largely not in play in the Bab el-Mandeb. It's a lot of ships going between Asia and Europe, because that's where it is on the map. It's not a major shipping route for the United States. And I think we are starting to see a tension within the Trump coalition that's tied to this. We've seen expressions of opposition to this expansion of the campaign against the Houthis from people like Steve Bannon, who has a very complicated relationship with President Trump, but is a former advisor of his, commands significant support among Trump's supporters, is an influential voice, and he essentially said the United States has no obligation to protect global shipping. And I think if you look at the rhetoric of America First, there is definitely a tension between doing America First and protecting global shipping, particularly trade between Asia and Europe. There's also an element of this that is, I think, tied to the Israel-Gaza conflict. That the Houthis have indicated their desire to continue fighting on the Strait as long as there's a conflict going on between Israel and Hamas, and that conflict is getting rolling again. And so some folks have speculated that this might have been an attempt to partially preempt what the Houthis might do in response to that. And one final layer on this is that the Houthis and the United States have been involved in an active military confrontation on the Strait for many months, over a year at this point. And there have been recent incidents in that confrontation. They shot down a drone of ours. There's been some various missiles fired. And so there's a logic of escalation that is coming from within the kind of pure U.S. Houthi conflict. And there's, when two countries or two entities are in a conflict, you're going to expect them to continue to be in a conflict absent some kind of broader change. And if that conflict starts to escalate, you get new leadership that's more inclined to fight back at attacks on the United States, which I think the Trump administration has some of those voices within it. I think then it's reasonable to expect, even absent all the other things going on around this confrontation, that there would be escalation here.
As a follow-up to the last point you made, brief, do you see any difference in the Trump administration's approach to Houthi behind the strategic caucus? Because Biden administration was also launching airstrikes against the Houthis in Yemen. The Trump administration is also doing it right now. Is the strategic caucus the same, or maybe there's a different approach in this administration than the last administration?
I think that they do see a linkage with Iran. They recognize that this is an Iranian, I think friend is probably the best word. Proxy does not quite describe the relationship, at least as most analysts see it. And so hitting them is something that can connect in the minds of the people who have this view to this broader campaign of pressure on Iran, which I think for some within the administration is a way to force the Iranian government into a crisis. I think for the president himself, it is a way to get a deal. And, there is a valid question here of how connected these two issues are. I think in reality, I am not convinced that military pressure on the Houthis is going to fundamentally transform the power of the Houthis. For one, they have survived a decade at war with one major power or another, one major regional power or another, and are still kicking. And in fact, this conflict enables them to distract the public in their territory from the failures of their own governance. And so there are benefits to the Houthis from this conflict. And I suspect that what's going on here is that the administration is trying to make the military damage exceed the benefits that they derive. I would see a similar logic in the Israeli strikes on Hodeidah port, where they struck infrastructure that was much more important, and where I don't think the United States would have allowed the Saudis to pull that off. So there's a lot of different voices on this conflict. I don't get the sense that there's really deep support for it, whether in the administration and certainly not in the public at large. And as I mentioned, there's division about it within the Trump base.
Switching from Yemen to Iran, and as you mentioned, the potential military pressure against Iran, how far do you think the administration is willing to go in its military approach with Iran? Could we see a return to targeted assassinations, broader strikes on Iranian assets in the region, or maybe a direct military action against Iran inside Iran? Do you think is it possible in the near future?
My suspicion is that the president himself is willing to give the Israelis a much wider range of motion in how they handle their relationship with Iran, including tolerating significantly greater actions by them, actions in new areas, actions of different scale. I don't know that is going to extend in the short term to a willingness to support them conducting, kind of what's been the big thing everybody's been wondering about for more than a decade at this point, which is, are they going to hit the nuclear program, or is the U.S. going to hit the nuclear program? And this is a problem that has confronted every administration, which is that there are significant risks to doing so. There's a risk of wider conflict. a conflict that would be hard to decisively resolve in America's favor, even with significant escalation, and one that might not produce decisive results. It might, but it might not. And so I think that there is going to be much sharper debate within the administration about the prospect of a strike. I think they don't want to get to the point that they have to make that decision. And the president personally seems to be very eager to move this into diplomatic channels. And as we've seen, the Iranians have not been very receptive to that. They've moved back and forth on it. They've said yes, they've said no. And so my concern is that both sides are going to continue raising pressure on each other, the United States, through tolerating certain kinds of actions from the Israelis, through sanctions, et cetera. And there are certainly voices in the administration that are happy to increase the pressure on this side. And then the Iranians are going to have choices about increasing their stockpile of nuclear material, the enrichment level, possibly things that they do around the region, although they're in a very weak military position right now. So those matters could come to a head with both sides merely trying to accumulate leverage and not necessarily intending a war. And it's a three-player game because the Israelis are involved here too.
So, as you've mentioned, and we can also see that the president himself is very eager to get a deal from Iran. He's mentioned it several times in his statements, and he has publicly stated that he sent a letter to Iran, to which they haven't officially responded yet. So what do you think? What could be the role of, as you mentioned, the third player here, what could be the role of Israel on the possibility of talks? And could Israeli pressure or influence within the administration push the president over the harder line than engagement?
The fact that the president has been saying these things out loud repeatedly, I would assume he's gotten some pushback from the Israelis already about that. It is something that the president cares about, and that makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of U.S. interests. The United States strategic priority right now is China. It's East Asia, or at least it ought to be. There's also a longstanding desire on the part of the American public to be less involved in foreign conflicts, and that's a desire that the president rode to election in 2016 and in 2024. And so it's a part of his constituency. And so I think that even with opposition from some quarters in Israel, there is still a powerful set of reasons for the United States to not be escalating here or to not encourage escalation. And I suspect, if you look at the people who the president has involved in this, people like his longtime associate and kind of personal envoy, Steve Witkoff, who is clearly a guy who's willing to act outside the traditional mold of U.S. relations in the region, including U.S.-Israel relations. He allegedly showed up in Israel on Shabbat and told Netanyahu said he wasn't available to meet, and Witkoff said, "No, you're going to meet with me." And these are the kinds of things that say he has personal backing from the president and is willing to play quite aggressively diplomatically. None of that signals to me that there's a really strong desire in the administration for escalation, and that they're trying to remain in the driver's seat here. Because if the Israelis start taking actions unilaterally, they're going to be more in the driver's seat in the U.S.-Israel action against Iran, or the U.S.-Israel political campaign against Iran. And no U.S. leader is going to want to be out of the driver's seat in this particular situation.
Then what about the Iranian side? Are they interested in talks? Because we haven't really gotten a clear response from the Iranian side, from the Islamic Republic, and we have an administration that is considered to be reformist, more pragmatic towards the West, but also we do not know how influential they are, the president himself and his team, in policymaking, whether they can really go over the positions of the security apparatus or the Supreme Leader himself. So what do you think about the Iranian strategy here? What are they trying to achieve? Because they also have a past with President Trump. So what do you think would their position there position be in the next stage of this potential escalation, or maybe the possibility of talks?
Yes, and I think a lot about that, saying that politics is a two-level game, international politics, that there's the international element of this and there's the domestic element of this. And I think in both cases, the situation in Iran is going to make it hard to get to a negotiated solution to this conflict. Leaving aside even the question of interests, there is a lot of lack of trust between the Iranians and the Trump administration between the Iranians and the United States, really, based on the U.S. exit from the JCPOA. and the whole long history of U.S.-Iran relations. Of course, the Iranians, the way they see that relationship is in pretty starkly negative terms, just as we have our own way of telling that story in pretty negative terms. So that layer is complicated. And then, of course, there's Iran's internal politics, which have multiple things happening right now, some of which push against bold diplomatic moves, some of which push in favor of bold diplomatic moves. I would note that the rumors about potential succession of the supreme leader have intensified. Those have been around for years. So I don't necessarily assume that the supreme leader is about to die until he's actually dead. And even then, I'm probably going to wait a bit before I'm certain, because there's been rumors like this for so many years. But people are starting to jockey for position to try to have an angle to shape the future of Iran after the passing of the supreme leader. And so that's one layer that's going to affect maneuvering on issues, including the nuclear file. There's also the standard competition that happens between different elements of the Iranian government, including the presidential administration, the Supreme National Security Council, to some extent the Majlis, the institutions that are around the supreme leader. All of these elements are interacting with one another and attempting to extend their influence within the conversation. There might be elements that benefit from the current situation of having heavy sanctions on Iran because they're the ones who, for instance, smuggle things in, or they make goods that would not be competitive in the event of a more open Iranian economy. And so those actors, are naturally going to push against deals with the United States, as well as simply hardliners who, for various ideological reasons, or because they are looking at the recent history of U.S.-Iran relations, do not believe that a deal with the United States is in the regime's interest, or that it is likely to actually bring the benefits promised. And I think President Pezeshkian and his administration are particularly interesting in this mix. He does have this reformist background, and we can assume that he wants to make a deal with the United States. I mean, this is kind of a long-standing element of reformist foreign policy, is that Iran needs to open up to Europe and to the United States. However, I cannot say that Pezeshkian has been terribly impressive as a political fighter. He's impressive, I guess, as a political survivor, because he's been in the game for a while. But even when you went back to the presidential debates, going on maybe 10 months ago, he was not the one taking the lead in advancing reformist messages in those conversations. It was Mustafa Pourmohammadi, who was, this kind of moderate former security state, not a serious candidate, who was much more direct and frank in those interactions, whereas future President Pezeshkian was hard to draw out on a lot of issues. He was hesitant to advance a clear point of view, and that's, in my analysis, has persisted into his presidential period, that there has not been what you saw during the Rouhani administration, which was this constant verbal sparring, very indirect verbal sparring with the supreme leader, with the IRGC, with some of these other elements within the state. And we know that these confrontations were happening behind closed doors, whereas Mr. Pezeshkian has been much more eager to present himself as being close to the supreme leader and as following his guidance. So this pattern of interaction has not really helped the emergence of a pro-diplomacy coalition within Iranian elite politics. So it's really hard to say where this is going to go. I believe it was Mr. Rouhani the other day who said, give it a few months and the supreme leader will change his mind. We've heard somewhat similar things from Mr. Pezeshkian, essentially saying, well, he doesn't support negotiations right now. I don't actually know that is supported by the data of what Mr. Khamenei has said publicly. Perhaps he's saying things privately, but it seems like wishful thinking on Pezeshkian's part and possibly on Rouhani's part. So that's all of these things make for a very concerning pattern, which is that these two countries, us and the Iranians, are in this heightening confrontation, and neither side has really, I think, fully reckoned with what's necessary for talks. I think that's particularly acute on the Iranian side. I think the Iranians are further from talks than the United States is. I think if the Iranians picked up the phone, this is just my opinion. I think you could have Witkoff meeting with Iranian negotiators one-on-one in Doha or somewhere within 48 or 72 hours. I assume that the obstacle, both in private and in public, is on the Iranian side.
That was a very detailed explanation. Thank you very much. And then, so what do you think would bring so what is the thing that that is right now pulling the Iranians back? Why is the supreme leader, do you think, is not necessarily interested in going forward with the negotiations, or at least signaling his intention that Iran might be positive with regards to the negotiations, and what could bring them to the table, or at least make them more positive about getting involved in the negotiations with the United States?
Well, the latter question is the $6 million question, I think it's going. I think part of this decision has to happen in Iran. I'm not sure that there's a magic formula to bring the Iranians to the table, especially if we're going to be, coloring within the lines on U.S.-Iran policy, even within the broader framework of U.S. foreign policy, the broader range of possibilities that Mr. Trump is open to compared to more conventional, traditional establishment administrations. It's still ultimately the Iranians that need to make a choice. Mr. Khamenei, he's not usually seen as somebody who is very interested in dealings with the West in general. You don't see him showing up in Brussels to conduct negotiations or praising the West, anything like that. And not that he is ignorant of the West, but that he does not see great possibilities for diplomacy there. And there's certainly a lot of voices around him, voices that he has put around him, who share that analysis. And then you've got this environment of extreme distrust caused by the long history of U.S.-Iran relations, compounded with the recent events, particularly the withdrawal from the JCPOA and the killing of General Soleimani. Those things just add for the difficulty, and I suspect that they are afraid of the current administration, that they fear what it might hold because of its unpredictability, because of its willingness to do things and consider things that other administrations won't. And I think right now, the U.S. administration is trying to emphasize the elements of that are positive for Iran. That this administration, I think, has much more political credibility to do a deal with Iran than any Democratic administration, simply because it's perceived as being tough on national security questions. Nobody has ever accused the president of being pro-Iran, and so he has a certain leeway to make that deal. At the same time, he's also somebody who is deeply embedded in the Jacksonian tradition of American politics, which is very concerned with honor, which at times can be rather violent. And so I think that the Iranians are looking at that and also saying, wow, we don't want to take away our sources of leverage, like the nuclear program or our missile program, and leave ourselves at the mercy of an American administration, especially when the present configuration of the administration could change. You could see people someday, like Hegseth, leave and have much more traditionally hawkish voices come in. So I totally understand that the Iranians are not eager to trust the United States right now. I think that is something of a misreading. And I think the sooner in the administration they make a deal, the better it is for them, because that deal has time to play out. The great challenge of the JCPOA was that it came at the very end of Mr. Obama's term and was not set in stone when the next term came in.
Thank you very much, John. This was a very thorough and detailed explanation, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation for this interview. Really glad to have this.
Excellent. Have a great day. Thank you for having me on.
Great day. Thank you very much.